The morning air was thick with unspoken words as I sat in the passenger seat of my daughter's car. The leather felt cold beneath me, and the faint smell of her vanilla coffee lingered between us like a bridge we couldn't cross. Sarah's hands gripped the steering wheel tighter than usual, her knuckles white against the dark interior. I watched her profile, searching for answers in the familiar lines of her face that had once been so easy to read. We drove through streets I didn't recognize, past buildings that seemed to stretch endlessly into a gray sky. The radio played softly, some gentle melody that felt inappropriate for the tension filling every corner of this small space. Sarah hadn't said much since she picked me up, just that we needed to talk, that there were things to discuss. Her voice had carried a weight I'd never heard before, heavy with something that made my chest tighten with worry. When we pulled into the circular driveway, I noticed the manicured gardens first. Roses bloomed in perfect rows, their red petals almost too vibrant against the pale stone of the building behind them. Sunny Meadows Senior Living Community, read the brass plaque by the entrance. My heart began to race as Sarah turned off the engine, the sudden silence deafening between us. This wasn't where I expected our conversation to take place. "Mom," Sarah finally whispered, her voice cracking like autumn leaves. She wouldn't look at me, instead staring straight ahead at the building's entrance, where elderly residents sat on wooden benches, some alone, others with visiting family members. I could see the tears gathering in her eyes, threatening to spill over, and suddenly I understood that this wasn't just a visit. This was something much more permanent, much more final. The sound of the trunk opening behind us felt like thunder in my chest. Sarah walked around to retrieve something I hadn't realized she'd packed, my small floral suitcase, the one I used for weekend trips to visit my sister. But my sister had been gone for 3 years now, and this wasn't a weekend trip. As Sarah carried my belongings toward the entrance, each step felt like a countdown to a goodbye I wasn't ready to say. Inside Sunny Meadows, everything smelled of lavender and disinfectant, a combination that tried too hard to feel like home, but only succeeded in feeling institutional. The lobby was decorated with soft pastels and artificial plants that would never need watering, never need the kind of care that real living things required. Sarah spoke in hushed tones with a woman behind the reception desk while I stood frozen, watching other families navigate their own difficult conversations in corners of the room. A man about my age shuffled past, wearing slippers and a confused expression, followed closely by a nurse who spoke to him with practiced patience. This couldn't be happening. This couldn't be my reality. I'd raised Sarah, loved her, sacrificed for her, and now she was leaving me here among strangers who smelled of loneliness and forgotten dreams. The betrayal felt sharp and immediate, cutting through every memory of the daughter I thought I knew. "Mrs. Henderson," the receptionist called my name with artificial cheerfulness. "We're so glad you're joining our family here at Sunny Meadows." Family? The word felt hollow when my actual family was preparing to walk away. Sarah finally looked at me then, her eyes red-rimmed and desperate, searching my face for some sign of understanding or forgiveness that I couldn't give. Not yet. Not when I didn't understand what was happening to us. The elevator ride to the 3rd floor felt eternal. Sarah held my hand, her palm damp with nervous perspiration, while we stood surrounded by motivational posters featuring sunrises and inspirational quotes about new beginnings. But this didn't feel like a beginning. It felt like an ending. Room 314 had my name already printed on a small placard, as if my arrival had been planned for much longer than I'd realized. The room was small but bright, with a single bed covered in a quilt that reminded me of one my mother used to have. A window overlooked the garden we'd driven past, and I could see those perfect roses swaying gently in the afternoon breeze. Sarah set my suitcase on the bed and began unpacking my clothes into an empty dresser, her movements mechanical and rehearsed, as if she'd practiced this moment 1,000 times in her mind. Why? The word escaped my lips before I could stop it, hanging in the air between us like smoke. Sarah froze, my favorite blue cardigan still clutched in her trembling hands. For a moment, we just stared at each other across this foreign room that was supposed to become my home. The question contained multitudes. Why here? Why now? Why without warning? Why me? Why us? It was the simplest word I knew, yet it felt impossibly complex in this moment. Sarah's shoulders began to shake as she sank into the room's single chair, burying her face in her hands. Her sobs came in waves, each one more heartbreaking than the last. But they didn't answer my question. They only made it larger, more urgent. I wanted to comfort her, the way I had when she was small and afraid, but my own hurt was too fresh, too raw. Instead, I sat on the edge of the bed and waited for an explanation that might help me understand how we'd arrived at this crossroads. "I can't," she whispered through her tears. "I can't explain it right now, Mom. I just need you to trust me. I need you to know that this is the hardest thing I've ever had to do, but I'm doing it because I love you, because I love Emma." My granddaughter's name hung between us like a bridge I couldn't cross. What did Emma have to do with any of this? What could a 7-year-old possibly have to do with my being here? The afternoon stretched endlessly as Sarah finished unpacking my belongings, each item finding its place in this new life I hadn't chosen. My photographs went on the nightstand, pictures of Emma at her last birthday party, of Sarah's wedding day, of my late husband Tom in his garden. These familiar faces would be my companions now, frozen moments of happiness that felt impossibly distant from this sterile room and its institutional furniture. When Sarah finally stood to leave, the goodbye felt inadequate. She kissed my forehead the way I used to kiss hers when she was small, whispering promises to visit soon, to call every day, to explain everything when she could find the words. But as the door closed behind her, I was left with nothing but silence and the growing certainty that my daughter had become a stranger, someone capable of decisions I couldn't comprehend. The first night in room 314 stretched like an eternity. The walls felt too close, the ceiling too low, and the sounds of this place, shuffling footsteps in the hallway, distant conversations between night shift workers, the soft beeping of medical equipment, created a symphony of unfamiliarity that kept sleep at bay. I lay on sheets that smelled of industrial detergent instead of the fabric softener I'd used for 40 years, staring at shadows that danced across an unfamiliar ceiling. The clock on my nightstand ticked with mechanical precision, each second a reminder that time here moved differently than it had in my own home. Back there, mornings had purpose: coffee to brew, garden to tend, phone calls from Emma telling me about school. Here, morning would bring institutional breakfast served at predetermined times, activities planned by people who didn't know that I preferred crossword puzzles to bingo, reading to television, solitude to forced socialization with strangers. My roommate, Mrs. Chen, slept fitfully in the bed across from mine, occasionally calling out names I didn't recognize. The nurse who'd introduced us earlier explained that Mrs. Chen's family visited every Sunday, bringing homemade dumplings and photo albums full of grandchildren. I wondered if Sarah would visit on Sundays, if she'd bring Emma, if my granddaughter would understand why Grandma suddenly lived in this place that smelled of other people's lives. The weight of abandonment settled over me like a heavy blanket I couldn't push away. Every relationship I'd ever cherished felt suddenly fragile, suspect. If Sarah could do this without warning, without adequate explanation, what did that say about the bonds I'd believed were unbreakable? The trust between mother and daughter felt shattered, replaced by questions that multiplied in the darkness like weeds after rain. As dawn finally broke through the window, painting the room in soft pink light, I realized that yesterday's life, the one where I was an independent woman in her own home, had ended as abruptly as a television being switched off. Today would begin my education in being a nursing home resident, a phrase that felt foreign on my tongue, a role I'd never auditioned for but suddenly found myself playing. The dining hall at Sunny Meadows buzzed with conversations I wasn't part of, and laughter that didn't include me. Breakfast arrived on sectioned plastic trays, scrambled eggs that tasted like powder, toast cut into triangles as if we were all children again, orange juice from a concentrate that bore no resemblance to the fresh squeezed version I'd made every morning for 50 years. Around me, residents navigated their own versions of displacement, some chatting easily with table mates, others eating in silence that spoke of their own recent arrivals. Mrs. Patterson, who'd claimed the seat next to mine without invitation, peppered me with questions between bites of institutional oatmeal. How long had I been here? Where were my children? Did I have grandchildren? Her curiosity felt invasive, yet I found myself grateful for any human connection in this sea of strangers. When I mentioned Sarah and Emma, her eyes lit up with recognition of shared experience. She too had been brought here by a daughter who'd cried and promised to visit regularly. The activities coordinator, a perpetually cheerful woman named Jessica, who couldn't have been older than Emma, announced the day's schedule with enthusiasm that felt forced and desperate. Arts and crafts at 10, chair exercises at 11, music therapy after lunch. These structured activities were meant to fill the hours that had once been mine to shape, meant to provide purpose in lives that had been stripped of their natural rhythms and responsibilities. I found myself watching the other residents, trying to decode their stories from the way they moved through this choreographed existence. There was Mr. Williams, who sat by the window every afternoon waiting for visitors who rarely came. Mrs. Rodriguez, who spoke fluent Spanish to photographs of children she kept in a worn leather wallet. Each person here carried their own version of my story, the sudden transition from independence to dependence, from familiar to foreign. The first week passed in a blur of scheduled meals, organized activities, and conversations with well-meaning staff members who spoke to me with the same tone reserved for children or pets. Every interaction reinforced my new status as someone who could no longer be trusted to manage their own life, someone whose daughter had made the decision that this was where I belonged. The resentment grew stronger each day, fed by the absence of explanation and the presence of so much unwanted care. By Thursday of my first week, I'd memorized the sound of Sarah's footsteps, so when I heard different ones approaching my room, disappointment settled in my chest like a stone. The activities coordinator knocked gently, reminding me about afternoon bingo, but I declined with the same polite firmness I'd used to refuse every organized activity since my arrival. I preferred to spend my time by the window, watching the parking lot for Sarah's blue sedan, counting the hours since our last brief, uncomfortable phone conversation. Other residents received visitors with predictable regularity. Mrs. Chen's Sunday dumplings, Mr. Williams' Wednesday afternoon grandson, Mrs. Rodriguez's entire extended family every Friday evening. I began to recognize the visiting patterns, the way the building's energy shift when families arrived with flowers, candy, and news from the outside world. The hallways filled with children's laughter and adult conversation, temporarily masking the institutional atmosphere with something that resembled normal life. When Sarah finally appeared on Friday afternoon, she looked smaller somehow, as if the weight of what she'd done had physically diminished her. She carried grocery store flowers, daisies and carnations wrapped in cellophane, and wore the same dress she'd worn to her father's funeral 3 years ago. The symbolism wasn't lost on me. This felt like another kind of burial, another permanent goodbye to life as we'd known it together. She pulled the room's uncomfortable chair closer to my bed and sat with her hands folded in her lap, searching for words that seemed to elude her. The silence stretched between us, filled with everything we weren't saying. I wanted to demand answers, to shake her until the truth spilled out, but something in her expression stopped me. She looked haunted, like someone carrying a secret too heavy to bear alone, yet too dangerous to share. "Mom," she finally whispered, "I know you don't understand. I know this seems cruel, impossible to forgive, but everything I've done to protect Emma, to protect you, to protect you. Someday, I hope you'll understand that leaving you here was the hardest decision I've ever made, but it was also the most necessary." Her words created more questions than answers, painting shadows where I desperately needed light to understand what had driven my daughter to such an extreme solution. The night shift nurse, Angela, had kind eyes and gentle hands that reminded me of my own mother's touch. Unlike the day staff who moved with efficient cheerfulness, Angela worked with quiet compassion, checking on residents with whispered conversations and understanding nods. She'd been working at Sunny Meadows for 15 years and had seen every variety of family drama play out in these halls, every permutation of love and loss that brought people to places like this. During one of her late-night rounds, she found me sitting by the window, unable to sleep for the fourth night in a row. Instead of offering sleeping pills or cheerful reassurances, she sat in the chair Sarah had occupied during her brief visit and waited for me to speak. When I finally voiced the question that had been consuming me, why would a daughter abandon her mother without proper explanation, Angela's expression shifted to something deeper than professional sympathy. "Sometimes," she said carefully, "the families who cry the most when they bring someone here are the ones who had the hardest time making the decision. Sometimes they've been struggling with something for months before they finally admit they need help." Her words felt like pieces of a puzzle I didn't know I was supposed to be solving, fragments of understanding that didn't quite form a complete picture, but suggested there was more to my story than abandonment and betrayal. She mentioned, almost casually, that she'd seen Sarah in the parking lot after visiting hours twice this week, sitting in her car with the engine off, just staring up at the building. "Families who don't care don't sit in parking lots crying," Angela observed. "They drop off their relatives and drive away without looking back. Your daughter can't seem to leave. That tells me something about the kind of person she is and the kind of decision this was for her." As Angela continued her rounds, I found myself reconsidering Sarah's behavior through this new lens. The trembling hands, the inability to maintain eye contact, the desperate way she'd kissed my forehead goodbye, these weren't the actions of someone acting callously. They were the actions of someone in pain, someone making a decision that hurt her almost as much as it hurt me. But knowing Sarah was suffering didn't answer the central question: what had driven her to believe this was necessary? Tuesday morning brought unexpected drama to Sunny Meadows when Mrs. Patterson had what the staff delicately called an episode. She'd awakened confused and agitated, calling for her deceased husband and trying to leave the building to meet him for their anniversary dinner. It took 3 staff members and a dose of medication to calm her down, and the incident left everyone on edge, residents and caregivers alike. The fragility of our mental states felt suddenly, uncomfortably visible. I was returning from the dining hall when I overheard 2 nurses discussing the morning's events near the medication station. Their voices carried more than they realized, and I caught fragments of professional conversation about early-stage dementia, family histories, and the difficult decisions adult children faced when aging parents could no longer safely live alone. The clinical language felt foreign, applied to people I was beginning to know as individuals rather than medical cases. "It's always hardest on the families who wait too long," one nurse was saying to the other. "By the time they finally admit there's a problem, something dangerous has usually happened. Like that new woman in 314, her daughter said she'd been having episodes for months before she finally got scared enough to act." My feet stopped moving as I realized they were talking about me, about Sarah, about episodes I couldn't remember having. The conversation continued as I pressed myself against the hallway wall, straining to hear details about my own life that had somehow been kept from me. Wandering at night, talking to people who weren't there, getting confused about time and place, the younger nurse recounted from what must have been my intake file. The final straw was when she tried to leave the house at midnight, convinced she needed to pick up her granddaughter from school. The little girl found her in the driveway in her nightgown. My blood felt like ice water in my veins as these foreign memories tried to find purchase in my consciousness. I couldn't remember any midnight confusion, any conversations with invisible people, any episodes that would justify the drastic action Sarah had taken. Yet the nurses spoke with the confidence of documented facts, of behavior patterns I couldn't recall, but that had apparently terrified my daughter enough to bring me here against my conscious will. That afternoon, I sat in my room trying to excavate memories that felt increasingly unreliable. Had there been nights when sleep eluded me and I'd wandered the house looking for something I couldn't name? Had I really spoken to Tom as if he were still alive, still working in our garden, still coming home for dinner after 30 years in the ground? The harder I tried to remember, the more elusive these supposed episodes became, like trying to grasp smoke with bare hands. Emma's face haunted my thoughts, my 7-year-old granddaughter who'd allegedly found me in the driveway in her nightgown. What must that have been like for a child, seeing her grandmother confused and lost in the darkness? The image felt like a knife in my chest, not because I could remember it, but because I couldn't. If I'd truly frightened Emma, if I'd become a source of anxiety rather than comfort in her young life, then perhaps Sarah's decision wasn't abandonment, but protection. I began paying closer attention to the other residents, looking for signs of the confusion that had allegedly plagued me at home. Mrs. Chen often called her roommate by her deceased sister's name. Mr. Williams regularly asked staff when his wife would be picking him up, though she died 5 years ago. Mrs. Patterson had recovered from her morning episode, but seemed uncertain about where she was or why she was here. Were these glimpses into my own recent past, behavior I'd exhibited but couldn't recall? The concept of lost time felt terrifying in a way I hadn't anticipated. If I couldn't trust my own memory, couldn't rely on my own perception of events, then how could I judge Sarah's actions? The foundation of my identity, the belief that I was a competent, independent woman who'd been wronged by an ungrateful daughter, began to crack under the weight of possibilities I'd refused to consider. When dinner time arrived, I found myself sitting across from Mrs. Patterson, studying her face for signs of the confusion that had overwhelmed her that morning. She seemed perfectly lucid now, chatting about her garden and her grandchildren as if the earlier episode had never happened. The hardest part, she confided, isn't the forgetting, it's the not knowing what you've forgotten. My daughter says I did things I don't remember, and I have to choose whether to trust her or trust my own mind. Sarah's next visit came on Sunday, and I watched her approach my room with different eyes, looking for signs of the burden she'd been carrying alone. She moved like someone much older than her 42 years, shoulders rounded by invisible weight, and when she knocked on my doorframe, her smile seemed to require tremendous effort. The flowers she brought this time were from Tom's favorite nursery, roses that smelled like the garden we'd tended together for 20 years. Instead of demanding answers with the anger I'd been nurturing all week, I found myself studying my daughter's face with new curiosity. The dark circles under her eyes spoke of sleepless nights. The tremor in her hands suggested anxiety that went beyond normal worry, and the careful way she spoke indicated someone choosing each word to avoid causing additional pain. This wasn't the behavior of someone who'd made an easy decision or one she felt good about. "Tell me about Emma," I said, instead of launching into accusations. Sarah's eyes filled with tears at the mention of her daughter's name, and suddenly I could see the 7-year-old girl caught between loving her grandmother and being frightened by behavior she didn't understand. "She misses you terribly," Sarah whispered. "She keeps asking when Grandma is coming home, and I don't know what to tell her because I don't know how to explain something I barely understand myself." For the first time since arriving at Sunny Meadows, I reached for my daughter's hand instead of pulling away from her touch. Her fingers felt cold and small, like they had when she was Emma's age and needed comfort after a nightmare. "I'm starting to understand that there are things I don't remember," I admitted, the words feeling strange on my tongue. "Things that scared you enough to bring me here, even though it broke your heart to do it." Sarah's relief was palpable, as if she'd been holding her breath for weeks, waiting for me to acknowledge the reality she'd been facing alone. Through her tears, she began to share details of the months leading up to my arrival here. The midnight wandering, the conversations with deceased relatives, the increasing confusion about time and place that had culminated in that terrifying night when Emma found me in the driveway, convinced I needed to drive to a school that was closed and dark. "It started small," Sarah explained, her voice barely above a whisper. "You'd repeat stories you'd just told me, or ask about Dad as if he might walk through the door any moment. I told myself it was normal aging, stress, loneliness. But then you called me at 3 in the morning, panicked because you couldn't find Dad and were convinced he was lost somewhere in the neighborhood. When I reminded you that he'd passed away, you became angry, accused me of lying to hurt you." The pattern she described felt like learning about a stranger who happened to share my name. Episodes of confusion that grew more frequent, more concerning, more dangerous. Times when I'd left the stove on and forgotten, or started to drive somewhere and become lost in neighborhoods I'd known for decades. The worst part, Sarah continued, was that you always seemed completely normal afterward, as if nothing had happened. You couldn't remember the episodes, so from your perspective, I was overreacting to problems that didn't exist. She told me about the night that changed everything, when Emma had awakened to find me standing in the driveway in my nightgown, car keys in hand, insisting I needed to pick her up from school. She tried to tell you it was nighttime, that school was closed, but you became agitated and confused. She was scared, Mom. My 7-year-old daughter was scared of her grandmother, and I realized I couldn't protect both of you while keeping you at home. The pediatrician Emma had visited the next day for nightmares, the conversations with elder care specialists, the impossible decision to choose between my independence and everyone's safety. Sarah had navigated this crisis largely alone, afraid to burden me with knowledge of symptoms I couldn't remember experiencing. I kept hoping it would get better, she sobbed. I kept thinking if I just watched you more carefully, helped you more, somehow I could fix it without having to make this choice. As the full scope of Sarah's dilemma became clear, my anger transformed into something more complex. Grief for the mother I'd apparently been losing without realizing it, gratitude for a daughter who'd made an impossible choice out of love rather than convenience, and fear about a future I couldn't predict or control. The nursing home placement wasn't abandonment, it was the desperate act of a woman trying to save everyone she loved from a situation that had no perfect solutions. In the days following Sarah's revelation, I began to see Sunny Meadows through different eyes. The structured schedule wasn't imprisonment, but safety, ensuring I wouldn't wander into danger during confused moments I might not remember. The medication routine wasn't control, but care, helping manage symptoms I couldn't recognize in myself. The staff's patient repetition of information wasn't condescension, but kindness, acknowledging that my brain sometimes needed multiple attempts to process and retain simple facts. Mrs. Patterson became my unexpected teacher in navigating this new reality. During one of our afternoon conversations, she shared her own journey from denial to acceptance. My daughter used to cry every time she visited, she told me, until I finally told her that I'd rather be safe and confused than free and dangerous. Once I stopped fighting the help, I could focus on enjoying the moments when my mind was clear and my memory was sharp. I began participating in activities I'd previously scorned, not because institutional bingo and chair exercises brought me joy, but because they provided structure for days when my own judgment might be compromised. Jessica, the activities coordinator, proved more perceptive than I'd given her credit for, designing programs that preserved dignity while acknowledging limitations. The craft projects weren't childish busy work, but exercises in maintaining fine motor skills and cognitive function. My relationship with the nursing staff evolved from defensive politeness to genuine appreciation as I understood their role in my safety net. Angela, the night shift nurse who'd first suggested there was more to my story, became a particular source of comfort during hours when sleep eluded me and memories felt unreliable. The hardest part of memory issues, she observed, isn't the forgetting, it's learning to trust others to remember for you. Emma's first visit since my placement was scheduled for the following weekend, and I found myself both eager and terrified to see my granddaughter again. Would she be afraid of me? Would I say or do something that confused or frightened her? Sarah assured me that Emma had been receiving counseling to help her understand that Grandma's brain is sick, not her heart, and that love remains constant even when memories become unreliable. Emma arrived on Saturday morning carrying a handmade card and wearing the dress I'd bought her for Easter, now slightly too small, but apparently still her favorite. She approached me with the cautious affection of a child who'd learned that adults weren't always predictable. But when I opened my arms, she ran to me with the same enthusiasm she'd always shown. "Grandma," she whispered against my shoulder, "Mommy says your brain is playing tricks on you, but your heart still knows how much you love me." Through Emma's uncomplicated wisdom, I saw our situation clearly for the first time. Love didn't require perfect memory or complete independence. It required presence, patience, and the courage to accept help when help was needed. As my granddaughter showed me around the facility with proud tour guide enthusiasm, introducing me to staff members as my grandma who lives here now, I realized that home wasn't a location, but a feeling of belonging and safety. Sarah watched our interaction with careful attention, ready to intervene if I became confused or agitated, but instead, she witnessed something healing. Emma and I colored together in the activity room, read stories in the library corner, and walked through the garden where those perfect roses bloomed with clockwork precision. My 7-year-old granddaughter accepted my new reality with the adaptability children possess, teaching me through her example that love could flourish even in unexpected circumstances. As visiting hours drew to a close, I pulled Sarah aside for a conversation I'd been preparing all week. "I forgive you," I told her, watching relief flood her features. "More than that, I thank you. Making the decision to bring me here when I couldn't make it for myself, that took more courage and love than I initially understood. You didn't abandon me. You saved me from abandoning myself to confusion and danger." The sunset through my room's window painted everything in golden light as Sarah and Emma prepared to leave. But this goodbye felt different from that first devastating departure. This time, we were saying goodbye with understanding, with plans for regular visits, with the knowledge that difficult decisions sometimes spring from the deepest love. Emma promised to draw me pictures of her school adventures, Sarah promised to bring updates from the outside world, and I promised to take care of myself so I could be present for all the moments when my mind was clear and my heart was full. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like this video. It helps more people find stories like this one. Subscribe to Voices After 50 for more true, emotional tales about love, time, and second chances. And before you go, watch the next story on our channel, another unforgettable journey about the loves we never truly lose.